So, hello everyone. This is the first meeting of the 2024 Oceania Ecological Forecasting Initiative. Our guest today is Anna Richards from CSIRO. Anna, your talk will be on, could the state and transition models concept be a useful tool for ecological forecasting? And for the sake of the recording, Anna's based at the Tropical Ecosystems Research Centre in Darwin in the Northern Territory. She calls herself a plant and a soil ecologist with a broad ecosystem management interest. Particularly in recent years, she's done research on land-based climate change mitigation methods for managing savanna fires and his impact on these methods on biodiversity and sustainable livelihood opportunities for remote Indigenous communities. Anna, we are a mix of terrestrial, marine, freshwater and atmospheric modelers with an interest in forecasting. Will you please try sharing your screen, and the rest of us will be on mute, and if you choose to go without your camera, we know the bandwidth reasons why. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Apologies, I was late. We had a bit of technical issues. So Alistair's already introduced this talk, but I just wanted to acknowledge my co-authors, Fiona Dixon, Suzanne Probar, Kristen Williams, Steve Roxburgh, Helen Murphy, Gary Cook, Dan Metcalf, Becky Schmidt, Amy Warnick and Jodie Hayward, who've been on a long journey around state and transition models and some of the information I'm going to talk about today. But before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands where I normally live and work, the Larrakia people up in Darwin, and pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and extend that acknowledgement and respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples on the call today. So some of you may or may not be aware of the state transition models developed by Mark Westerby and colleagues in 1989. And at the time it was developed, there was the dominant theory of succession was around ecosystems following a linear path to a single stable climax community. And the state and transition modelling concept model might be quite a strong word in this. It's more like a conceptual framing of landscape change. Identified that landscapes behave in non-linear fashions. They can display hysteresis, where you can move from different landscapes are in different states, different attributes of structure, function and composition to another part of the landscape, but you might not be able to return to where you came from on the same pathway. They're quite useful for clearly communicating information or understanding of changes in landscapes, and they explicitly include human actions. You can quantify these models with different types of data. It might be quantitative, it might be expert knowledge and so forth. And I'll go into this in a few slides down there. You can capture internal or transient dynamics as well as dynamics that are irreversible. The nuts and bolts of state and transition models, for those that have never come across them before, are very simple. And this is an example on the slide. There is a state and transition model for temperate eucalypt woodlands developed by Megan Good and colleagues back in 2021. You can see the main thing I wanted to point out to you from this diagram is the states, which are those black boxes, and the arrows, which are the transitions. So states, as normally in these models, have a reference state and modified states. And those are grouped in terms of common types of modification relative to the reference. Each ecosystem state needs to have a unique combination of structural, functional and compositional characteristics. And states are generally resilient to disturbance. So if they get perturbed, they'll maintain their organisation, those attributes over time. When you do shift an ecosystem state through intensive perturbation, you transition to another state. And those transitions are the arrows, as I mentioned, and they describe the pathway through which an ecosystem may move from one state to another. Generally, transitions are irreversible without active management intervention or a long time frame. And they're described by characteristics including the driver of that transition, time frames, probabilities that can be conditional probabilities. This is a very simple example of some ecosystem states on the left, from yellow and grey box woodlands in north central Victoria. You can see these states might be complex native ecosystems right through to agricultural ecosystems, and the attributes that you'd use to describe these would depend on sort of those images there. So you might use a lot of soil attributes to describe some of those agricultural systems, whereas you might rely more on the structural and compositional attributes of the tree canopy in those other states. And actually, it's just a point. You'll see that a lot of my information coming from a plant ecology background. Apologies, a lot of my examples will come from terrestrial ecosystems, but the general concepts apply in ecosystems where you might be more dominated by fauna rather than plant species, for example. Some of those transition drivers might be altered fire regimes, modified hydrological conditions, removal of vegetation and so forth. And it can also be restoration actions. And under that restoration actions title is a whole bunch of other drivers that could be subsets of restoration activities. So I mentioned that this concept was developed in 1989 and it was extensively used in rangelands for quite some time. And the box and arrow models were basically developed conceptually, usually in many cases, and as a way to understand different options for land management and the outcomes of those different management actions. And they actually sort of moved, or the concept was taken up more broadly in the US than in Australia, into rangelands and then across into the forest and other shrublands and other areas in the US. And in the about 11 to 13 years after the concept of state and transition models came out, in North America at least, they started to develop the concept of state and transition simulation modelling. And I'm going to come back to this point because that's where we go from a conceptualisation of historical landscape change and how that's been instigated through different land management actions through to forecasting what those land management actions might do in the future, which is the whole point of I guess, this talk. So you can see some of the groups that are using or storing state and transition model information in the US are the US Department of Agriculture. So there's a website there for the Jornada Experimental Range, which hosts a large number, I think it's around 5,000 state and transition models. And the Nature Conservancy through the Landfire Program hosts a large number of state and transition models too. So we'll come back to that point, but I just wanted to move into how we've been thinking about state and transition models more recently in Australia, which has been a slightly different trajectory to the US. What we were thinking when we started to tackle this idea, and this is back in about 2017, and it comes through in a project called the Australian Ecosystem Models Framework, is how do we consistently understand and interpret landscape change? How do we understand when the changes in structure, function and composition that we observe in our landscapes are resulting in a transition to another state, which will have different condition in terms of ecological integrity and other characteristic, other values, for example, and how and when is it this change that we observe in our landscapes a transient change and it doesn't result in a state change. And this is important for looking at the effectiveness of different land management interventions, or if we want to forecast the effectiveness of different management actions into the future, we need to be able to unpack these different types of change. So this is sort of explaining that in a different way. You can see on the diagram here on the left, York Gum woodlands in Western Australia in what we've called a reference state, so a state that has high ecological integrity, that provides habitat condition that maintains the persistence of biodiversity, all biodiversity that could occur in that state across space and time. But across space and time, this York Gum woodland could look quite different in terms of its faunal communities, its plant communities, its structure and function as a result of changes in driven by drought and fire. You can see also on the right-hand side is a York Gum woodland, but this one has transitioned to another ecosystem state as a result of eutrophication from grazing and cropping nearby. And you can see that this also has an alteration structure, function and composition, and there's variability in that between different cycles of drought and non-drought periods. But this is a different state that would have a different level of condition and support a different the persistence of a different level of biodiversity. So these types of changes were what we were trying to capture in something called the Ecosystem Models Framework. So the framework, or the basis for the framework, was a consistent way to describe ecosystem change where we can detect a change in ecological integrity or condition for biodiversity, and inevitable values. And the idea was to capture the deep observational knowledge of experts in a consistent way across Australia and synthesise that in a way that's accessible in these series of booklets and in a consistent framework. And you can go to the website and read a bit more about that. So the framework has two parts to it. One part is a set of archetype dynamic ecosystem models, which describe disturbance, biomass and recovery dynamics for ecosystems in their reference. And so a lot of the information in these archetype models is observational, or in some cases we don't observe these references ecosystems anymore. So it's our best understanding of what would have typified an ecosystem if it's in its reference in terms of its disturbance and recovery dynamics. And those disturbances may be disturbances driven by people or non-anthropogenic actions. And they're disturbances to which ecosystems have adapted. So the fire regimes that maintain ecosystem integrity, or the drought regimes that maintain ecosystem integrity, and so forth. Those archetype models, there's 46 of them across the Australian continent. They cover areas, terrestrial ecosystems, palustrine wetlands, coastal ecosystems, right down to the intertidal zone. We don't have very good models yet for in-channel aquatic freshwater systems, so rivers and lakes, and we don't have any models in the proper marine space either, although there's some work in developing those now. We've been using these archetype models as a template for developing state and transition models where you include these modified ecosystem states. The archetype models have a conceptual in that they're descriptive because the archetype is a very high level description of a broad ecosystem type that might extend across half the continent. When we develop state and transition models, we often develop them for a specific purpose. And so you can start to put numbers, they'll be for a particular region or location, where you can start to put numbers on that fire return interval or that drought return interval. So for example, we have an archetype model for rainforests that covers the wet tropics right through to Tasmania. But if you're using that archetype model as a template for a state and transition model in Tasmania, then you'd want to put a different drought or storm disturbance regime in there than you would up in North Queensland. The other thing that is of note in this, and you can see from the diagram, are these green boxes called expressions. And this just indicates the transient variability that we see within ecosystems that I was explaining before for the York Gum Woodland. So that transient variability is maintained as you transition out of the reference and into modified states, and often mimics in some way the transient variability that you observe in the reference. So these are the shifts between expressions, successional pathways, and dynamics driven by endogenous, what we call endogenous disturbances, things like fire and drought, flood, and so forth. Whereas the transitions, the shifts between ecosystem states, are driven by exogenous disturbances outside of what ecosystems have adapted to, and these might be altered fire regimes like that list I had, or vegetation removal, or invasive species, and so forth. The only other thing I wanted to note in these models is this maintenance disturbance. This is quite important. So in the different states, you might have a disturbance that sits, that's not driving transient variability, that maintains an ecosystem in that state. And this might be something like a particular grazing regime, or in some cases, instead of that fire regime being unpacked in the expressions, it might be sitting at the state level. So often we get asked, why do we have all these extra boxes, which makes things quite complicated, and why do we need these templates? So I'll try to go through those. So the archetype models essentially are a template for common responses of ecosystems to endogenous disturbances. And the archetype models are providing an indication of the ecological memory that persists with ecosystems as they are confronted with contemporary disturbance regimes. And so if we understand that archetype dynamic, then allows us to understand how ecosystems are behaving to current disturbances or how they might behave to new disturbances. Grouping ecosystems into these similar response classes can help with the consistency in the way we describe state and transition models. So you can imagine you could do these state and transition models all over the country, but you want a consistent framing for them, and that's one way that we're using these archetype models. as well as helping with nesting and scaling of state and transition models. So you can do a state and transition model at a very local scale or regional or subnational scale. If you nest it within this template, then that helps with that scaling. And the extra boxes, the expressions, are useful for locating ecosystem states on the ground. So often you'll need indicators of ecosystem states for on-ground managers to detect what state they're in. And if you don't include some of this transient variability, it's very difficult sometimes on the ground to work out which state you're in. So that's why we include those. So I think I've gone through these already. So those endogenous disturbances are distinguished from the transition disturbances. To locate an archetype model, we've grouped them into vegetation umbrella classes, and these look very similar to major vegetation groups in NVIS. For those of you that are familiar with the National Vegetation Information System, and we've just done that as an anchoring point to allow people to enter the framework. This isn't a vegetation classification system. It's grouping existing vegetation types into broad disturbance and biomass recovery groups. So here's an example for eucalypt woodlands. There's 5 models in this booklet. It's actually published on the website if you want to have a look. You can see these are very broad, woodlands that regenerate from seeds. So they're killed by fire and reseed versus those that resprout. There's dynamics where there's a long regular drought, so the tropical eucalypt woodlands, and then there's ones disturbed by inundation, the floodplain woodlands and so forth. Sorry, for each of these texts, there's experts that contributed to them, there's photographs, and there's this diagram. And this diagram, the different green colours mean different things. So these are the expressions. So this is the archetype model for the reference. The dark green expression is probably the describes the characteristics that you would most likely envisage if you were thinking about a floodplain eucalypt forest and woodland. So that would be the mature expression of that system. And then we have other more transient expressions there. So the dense pole stage and dense seedling eucalypt stands, reduced tree canopy. The models also point to other models. So we have a separate wetlands, Palestine wetland archetype model, but we realise these that, the landscape is continuous. It's not separated into boxes. And so this indicates that there is a disturbance dynamic that will shift you out of an inland, essentially what you would classify in a vegetation sense as an inland floodplain, to a wetland system, and vice versa. If you went into the wetland model, you'd see the return. We can have information in the models, although we don't always get it, about the distribution of these expressions across a landscape that provides an indication of landscape conditions. So a landscape that has ecological integrity would have most of the landscape in that mature floodplain, eucalypt forest and woodland, and only a small percentage in these other expressions, and generally across space and time. So I'll give you an example of how these are used in a workshop setting, which is generally how we produce these state and transition models from the archetype model. And this is an example from the Kimberley, which is where we're working with the Western Australian Department of Primary Industries and Regional Development to develop models for tussock grasslands that occur extensively across the Kimberley region that would help with management. So they were interested in understanding what different states they observe across particularly the pastoral estate in the Kimberley. What are some of the pathways out of those states to less degraded states, and how effective are those actions or those transitions in shifting states. So we start with a 2-day workshop. Well, actually before the workshop, we start with identifying which archetype models apply to that landscape. We'll often use vegetation maps to locate where those archetype models would be. Gather experts. We use the archetype as a template for the reference state model. Here's the template on the left for tussock grasslands. And then we ask experts to use that template to describe modified ecosystem states. So there's a lot of modifications in the Kimberley as a result of grazing. So this is an example of a mixed unpalatable perennials dominant state. And you can see their expressions in those modified states that describe transient dynamics reflect the fire and drought dynamics in the reference state, but with some changes in the characteristics of those expressions. And then we ask experts to list the plausible transitions between ecosystem states. So including their timeframes, any preconditions. So some transitions might only occur in parts of the landscape near rivers and creeks, and the likelihood. So here's an example. I've split the state and transition model for the Kimberley into two parts. And the desirable and undesirable text is associated with grazing land, desirable for grazing land management or undesirable for grazing land management. Each of these grey boxes is an ecosystem state, and there's different drivers, shifts, or transitions between them. Here's the desirable transitions, and each of those grey boxes can be unpacked into these that more detailed description of transient change expressions. So that's sort of the first part of the talk, and it's describing these models, conceptually how they've been developed. They're used in the US. The US is also including expressions and transient change within their ecosystem state models. There's a lot of information in the US, not so much in Australia. We haven't quite got there, of storing the state and transition model, and many different experts have contributed to that. And then these are conceptual models with some quantitative information for understanding landscapes today. But then to make these models more quantitative so we can bring them into a forecasting space, there's been a move to these state and transition simulation models. And one of the more recent advances in these happened in around 2016. It was driven by Colin Daniel. You can see the publication there. And Colin, through his company Apex RMS, developed something called STSim, which is State Transition Simulation Models. It's a forecasting tool. It's freely available, and you can go in there and you can forecast a future landscape and its ecosystem states based on several pieces of information. The process is stochastic, so you generate a likely a likely landscape of ecosystem states, and it uses a modified Markov chain process. You can do the simulations spatially or non-spatially, depending on your starting data sets. So essentially, the required information is what your starting state is and transition probabilities or transitions out of that state to other states, including transitions that might be driven by successional processes, disturbance, and management. The state and transition simulation models implemented through a software platform called SynchroSim, which allows you to do a lot of scenario modelling in this space. And there's quite a lot of publications if you go to the website of the use of this tool in forecasting in the United States and Canada. I'll give you an example of where this forecasting really comes, what the critical part of this forecasting is in these state and transition models, and it's in those transition drivers. And this is an example of a floodplain eucalypt forest state and transition model that I showed early on. And here you can see a reference floodplain eucalypt woodland and a modified state that these ecosystems can transition through to, driven by logging, alterations in flood regimes, so reduced flood inundation and weed invasion. And you can specify this transition in a number of different ways. So you might have gone to a workshop and asked experts for their best opinion on the time frame for that transition, so 2 to 5 years, and the probability given these drivers that you will move from the reference state to a modified state, which in this case was 0.8. You can also specify this transition using different pieces of information. So you might have a projected flood frequency under a future climate scenario, and you might code into the model that this transition would only occur when you see a reduction in flood frequency to a certain rate. Or you could have a coupled river hydrodynamic model, which fully models the river and its flow projections. Or you might have a spatially explicit weed invasion model. And all of those things, with the current software, this STSim can speak to or call up information or parameters and outputs from these other external models and use that to drive these transitions. So you've got a bit of flexibility in how you simulate that future landscape. I've grabbed these slides from a colleague of mine, Dr. Louis Provencher, who works at the Nature Conservancy. He's the head of science there in Nevada. And he's been using these types of state and transition simulation models for a number of years in a process he calls landscape conservation forecasting. So this is giving you an example of where they've been applied in the forecasting space. This is an example of a model applied in Nevada for a region managed by the US Forest Service, I believe, and the Bureau of Land Management. And what Louis does is he starts with a state and transition model that's been developed with experts. He then produces a map of these ecosystem states. So you can see there's two maps there, one of the ecosystem type, and there's a number of ecosystem types in this landscape, and each one has a set of ecosystem states, some in reference and some in modified. He calls them vegetation classes. And then he has, sorry, I'll go back there, those blue arrows are the transitions, and each of those transitions he specifies a driver and a probability. And different, and then you can to model different scenarios through the tool. And in this case, he was looking at different restoration scenarios in that landscape habitat. So each of these ecosystem states has a different score for habitat suitability for sage-grouse, which is a threatened bird species in this landscape. And he can look at different time periods with different management actions, the effectiveness of that action for in the conservation of this species. So I guess that's where we're moving from just producing a forecasting map of ecosystem states to then linking those states to certain values. So that example of the landscape conservation species as one value that you might be modelling tool is that you can bundle different values, because the state and transition model concept is essentially around departure from reference or ecological integrity. So because of that, because they explicitly describe changes in ecosystem condition or ecosystem function, you can start to unpack that as a how that would relate to different values that you might be interested in. And so this is an example of some work. Essentially, often accounts are in the past, they're describing ecosystem services that flows from landscapes in historically, but you can also move that into a future flow of ecosystem services. And I just wanted to show this slide to talk about that bundling idea. So this is a state and transition model on the left there for tussock grasslands again, this time not McKimberley, it's actually over in Queensland. And you can see there's 5 different ecosystem states. There's a lot of grazing is controlling the transitions between these ecosystem states. And I want you to look at the spider diagrams, which are essentially different values that you might associate with that ecosystem state. So each of these states has a condition score. This was developed using an overlay with the ecosystem state and transition model and the habitat condition assessment system. With that condition score, you can calculate persistence of biodiversity in these different states. You can include with that persistence measure, it includes the arrangement of states in a landscape. So it includes information on connectivity, which impacts biodiversity persistence. And so you can see how these states will impact that through the proportion of original threatened species habitat. These states also have a proportional contribution to carbon storage and carbon sequestration in that landscape. We've also calculated the contribution of the ecosystem state to livestock production. And then a final piece of information is work was done with a different model to calculate the amount of livestock that could be produced from that ecosystem state that wouldn't result in a transition to another state. So to get to that landscape condition, future landscape condition, we go through this process that I've kind of hinted at before. And once we have that final landscape condition map, that allows us to understand changes in other values. So we start with these templates, and I talked about the archetype model templates, but we're also in the process of producing templates for modifications broadly across the continent for ecosystem states. And I'll mention this project run through Turn. It's just started at the end. These come through to workshops where we elicit expert knowledge around the boxes and arrows in the ecosystem states. We get experts to give us quantitative information that allows us to map those ecosystem states in the currently. So that's that ecosystem state map that can feed into STSIM. And we also gather other information around those states, including a condition score, which can be produced through surveys or through a combination of surveys and the habitat condition assessment system, which I won't go into, but happy to answer questions about that. Then you need, in order to produce a forecasted future map of ecosystem states and their condition, landscape condition, you need a suite of management scenarios, and you need those transition probabilities. So forecast of habitat condition enables prediction of biodiversity persistence in a future landscape, which might be useful for a number of applications. Some other work that's been done, particularly in the US, is predicting or forecasting future carbon stocks and flows in those landscapes. This takes the state and transition simulation modelling concept and adds in a stock and flow model, in this case a carbon stock and flow model called Lucas. So essentially that's linking a state and transition modelling approach, which is where we have a discrete, a landscape is broken up into discrete states, and linking it to a continuous variable, which is changes in carbon. And there's an example here that Ben Sleeter's done for the US, which is predicting change in total ecosystem carbon stocks under 2 different climate scenarios in US forests with different reforestation activities, management activities. So the last bit, that's very close to the end, I just wanted to sort of go through other parts to that forecasting space that isn't in the state and transition model. So the state and transition model is a great way to capture expert knowledge and other different knowledge systems and combine them in a conceptually consistent way to understand landscape change. But that's required in addition to that state and transition model to those types of information are scenarios of social and economic change that could be observed in the future.
I'm sorry, your audio just cut out and then it came really fast at the end there. Can you just go back to this slide here and just give us the recap starting from that? No, the next one. Yep, what do we need for the future? Thank you. Will you just go again, please?
Thanks, Alistair. Yeah, we'll do. Okay, so I was just sort of saying that state and transition models are just one part of a forecasting puzzle. There's a lot of information that you need. But probably the useful thing about state and transition models is that they enable us to capture different types of knowledge in a conceptually coherent way. So it's a way to capture expert knowledge into a process where you can also combine it with other models that may be more empirical models or other types of information from remote sensing and so forth. So I sort of have a list here of some of the things that are in addition to that state and transition model, which can capture the human dimensions of land management, I guess. One of those is scenarios. So needing to articulate future scenarios, which would drive your state and transition simulation. So these might be environmental, social, and economic scenarios. Another one is consideration of scale. So some of the information that comes out of state and transition models might be a point scale piece of information, and then to scale that up to landscape scale processes, you need additional types of models and calculations. The state and transition model does allow you to include multiple lines of evidence or multiple different knowledge systems potentially, and that's one aspect that we're interested in exploring further, and we're working with First Nations organisations in some parts of the country to look at the framing in state and transition models or alternative parallel framings that might be more suitable for First Nations knowledge and values. And then there's this need to account for ecological legacies and memories, which is something that the state transition modelling concept explicitly tries to do. So I just wanted to go back to this slide just to remind you around the transition drivers. This is one part of the state transition simulation modelling tool where we can bring in or start to chain different models and information together to understand future landscape change. And this is something that my postdoc, Jamie Furlow, is looking at. It's a horrendous diagram, but I'll simplify it like this, is to looking at future fire risk to ecological assets. So he's taking one part, state and transition model, which describes how ecosystems, states and landscape change with fire, adding it to that stock and flow model to simulate biomass change. And then he's going to explore if he can include that in biomass change, which can be converted to fuels, in a fire spread model that brings in other pieces of information like future climate projections to predict future fire regimes, which then can feed back into a state and transition model. And then I've shown previous slides how the information from an ecosystem state and transition model can then be linked with models of biodiversity persistence through ecosystem condition to look at changes in biodiversity from those different future fire regimes. So it's a sort of a concept around linking different pieces of information and models and tools together to provide a better understanding of future landscapes. And essentially, this is the last slide here, is this integration of different tools is probably where we need to be if we're trying to forecast the future, is bringing together, rather than making very large models, is bringing together some of these very good models and linking them through, now that we have the computing power to do that. So we're bringing in real-time observations, undertaking scenarios, developing modelling platforms that are in the cloud that have that good latency and other aspects that are required to run multiple models. Biodiversity models I mentioned, state and transition, which brings in expert knowledge, simulation capability, and other process-based models as well. So, sorry, this is the last slide. So there's two next steps that I just wanted to highlight. One was this TURN project that's recently been funded, called a National Ecosystem Assessment System for Australia, and that's developing infrastructure to house state and transition model information so that it could be useful for management applications or forecasting applications or other sorts of information. And this project is also developing those templates of modified ecosystem states, like I mentioned before. And another project that another postdoc of mine, Katrina Zetti, is involved in, which is funded through the Valuing Sustainability Future Science platform, is exploring tools for developing scenarios and eliciting expert knowledge for developing these state and transition simulation models. And she's using participatory gaming methods and virtual reality to help experts visualize or develop scenarios and help them to interrogate their expertise around transitions and ecosystem states in the future. And just like to acknowledge everyone who contributed to a lot of work that I've shown here today.
Hannah, thank you very much for the way that you've presented that to us. It's really, really great. I feel like I went from 0 to 60 in an hour on state and transition model. Thank you. May I just ask you, as to kick off the questioning for the audience as well, how do you think state and transition models do at handling kind of extreme events that will give us a tipping point in one time step versus accumulated stress? Is the only difference in the probability of switching? You know, my ecosystem is going to receive stress over a number of years before it may switch, or it might switch from a single event like a bushfire.
Sorry, Alistair, can you hear me now?
Yes, I can. Thanks.
Yeah,
thanks for coming
apologies, back. That just froze on me. Sorry, you were reiterating the question and then I lost you.
Thank you. I'm just asking that in the way that we seem to specify transition probabilities, does that make a difference whether it's an extreme event or whether it's a slow change driver that is going to cause the switch? It seemed to me like you would just have handled that with the switching probability.
Yeah, you can just have a switching probability, and it doesn't matter if you can have a time frame on that transition. It might be a very short time frame, or it could be a longer time frame. So it might be a successional process where you might have a state that's, for example, a replanted forest that's going from a very young forest to a very older mature forest, and that might take 50 years, and you can have that process, that transition occurring. You can give it a probability, so you sort of see a slow shift in the trees from one box to the other, from one state to the other, or it might be a very quick transition, which a clearing event or a logging event would be very fast, or if you're thinking more about climate change tipping points, it could be a large flood or bushfire that could be very quick. Yep.
Beauty, thank you. Invite other questions from the audience.
Alex has his hand up.
Shall I go for one? Could you explain sort of what's the fundamental difference between a state and transition model and a dynamic vegetation model, and when you would use one versus the other?
Yeah, good question, Alex. So a state and transition model is essentially breaking the landscape up into these discrete states, whereas you might have a model that uses physiological-based mechanisms to grow trees and other aspects of the landscape. You can eventually link the two, and this has been done. They've done this in the US. So you might have an understanding that your landscape moves from one state to another through a successional process, and that successional process and how long it takes could be linked to a dynamic vegetation model. So that brings in climate, it brings in physiological processes that grow trees, and your transition would only occur once that vegetation model has been run and it's producing an output that says now we have this certain biomass of vegetation in the landscape, and then you would enact a transition. And if all you were interested in, I guess, is there's some places where you wouldn't bother having a state and transition model because you might just be interested in climate carbon feedbacks in the atmosphere, and you're just essentially treating vegetation as a carbon pool, and that's fine. But if you wanted to add other information like biodiversity impacts or things that are related to ecosystem condition, then you might want to use some of the state and transition information framing to help you bring in those other that other type of information or change you're observing.
Thanks.
So there's one in the chat from Matthias. So Matthias asked in the chat, he says, I was wondering whether you've developed any protocols or standardized workflows for how the transitions could be fit from data and how models could be validated. I think definitely transitions can be fit from data, and that could either be modeled information or measured information. That definitely happens already, and that's how a lot of people will parameterize these state and transition simulation models. I think expert information is where you're in a data poor environment and you can only have expert knowledge. For the validation process, one option for validation is to do some hindcasting. So if you wanted to test your assumptions in your state and transition model, your assumptions around probabilities of transitions between different states, what you can do is run that model in the past and generate a current day landscape, and that will pretty quickly show you how off you are in your rates of fire return that you've specified for particular vegetation types and so forth. So that's one way that you can validate those transition probabilities in your model.
Thanks. My video doesn't work, so I was wondering, you're developing these archetype sort of templates for these models, so I was wondering whether you also develop associated tools to do these steps, so in order to do that in a standardized way for different ecosystems across the country, such that you can compare their performance across different environments, etc.
So yes, we've been thinking about this. I don't know if we've got there yet, but yes, we've got starting to develop standardized methods, I guess, for eliciting the expert information needed to specify transitions where we don't have any other information. If we have long-term fire history for sites, we can probably specify that from those fire mapping work rather than needing to ask experts what the fire return interval is for a particular landscape. But in many places we might not have information on that, and so we're developing a standard way to elicit that information from experts. This is for the transitions, but also for describing these modified states I mentioned before and other aspects. Is that sort of, we're not there yet though. It's a long way to go.
Yeah, thanks.
Anna, thank you very much for presenting to the group today.